first bullet hit the dirt 6 inches from his boot. Then came the rest. They tore through branches, ripped into stone, and screamed past his head like hornets. The patrol hadn't even made it 50 yards from the outpost. Now they were pinned, 6 men, trapped in a kill zone so tight that movement meant death. Machine gun fire from the tree line, mortars from the ridge. Every echo bounced between the mountains like thunder that never ended. He dove behind a boulder no bigger than his backpack. The dust stung his eyes, the air tasted like metal, and somewhere in his headset, a voice was shouting coordinates he couldn't even hear. In the Korengal Valley, there was no such thing as safe ground. This was Afghanistan, 2007, a 6-mile stretch of rock and pine where every shadow could kill you, and every soldier wondered which patrol would be his last. If you want the real stories from the wars we were never supposed to hear, the ones buried under classified reports and silence, subscribe now. Because this isn't a movie, it's what hell looks like when it wears a U.S. uniform. The radio hissed with static. The squad leader slammed against the rock beside him, shouting something he couldn't make out. Rounds cracked through the trees, splinters flying like glass. The valley had no mercy. It only echoed your fear back at you. The men returned fire blindly, rifles snapping through smoke and dust. No one could tell where the shots came from. The noise lived everywhere. The lieutenant tried to call for air support, but the signal bounced off the walls of the valley. The radio turned to static. They were alone. 10 minutes until air. That's what command said. But in the Korengal, 10 minutes was a lifetime. A mortar landed close, too close, throwing him face first into the dirt. His vision went white. He could taste blood. He didn't even remember firing back, only the rhythm of the trigger, the brass spilling down the slope, and the smell of cordite in the wind. Somewhere above, an Apache screamed across the sky. But the enemy didn't stop shooting. They never did. Because here, in the valley the army called unwinnable, the war wasn't about ground or politics. It was survival, one ridgeline at a time. The ground shook again. Another mortar landed closer, closer than physics should have allowed. He heard someone shout, "Move!" Boots scrambled, sliding on shale. The valley's walls turned sound into chaos, every shot ricocheting 100 times before it died. A corporal went down hard. No time to check. 2 men grabbed his vest and dragged him through the dirt, rounds snapping overhead. The medic crawled through smoke, shouting for morphine that didn't exist. Another explosion. The ridge shuddered. Pebbles stung their faces. The radio man finally caught a fragment of command. Air support inbound. ETA 7 minutes. 7 minutes. They believed it because they had to. High above, a spotter in a cave whispered coordinates in Pashto. A moment later, another mortar tube coughed. The round arced lazy and perfect. It landed 20 yards behind the Americans. The shock wave rolled through them like an earthquake. The medic shouted for a tourniquet. The smell of blood and burnt powder mixed in the air. Somewhere in the static, the lieutenant's voice cracked like a prayer. Talon 1, we're painted. Drop everything you've got. A pause, then. Copy. Danger close. The sky split open. 2 Apaches dropped out of the clouds like executioners. Hellfire missiles streaked toward the ridges, trailing smoke that turned white in the sunlight. Impact, a roar that felt alive. Trees disintegrated. The mountains coughed fire. For the first time in an hour, the gunfire stopped. The lieutenant looked down at his trembling hands, the gloves black with soot. He laughed once, too hard. "Still breathing," he muttered. The medic didn't answer, just tightened the tourniquet and looked away. They had survived the opening act. But in the Korengal, survival was never victory. It was just permission to fight again tomorrow. Morning in the Korengal never arrived gently. Sometimes the light came cold and silver, sliding through the trees like a blade. Sometimes it burned orange through the dust of the night before. But it was never peaceful. Quiet here didn't mean safety. It meant reload time. They called their position Restrepo, A handful of huts, sandbags, and wire bolted into a cliff face above a river that shimmered like broken glass. From the air, it looked invisible. From the ground, it looked doomed. Every ridge above was perfect for snipers. Every trail below was built for ambush. The lieutenant walked the perimeter at dawn. The wire was still intact, though new footprints dotted the soil just beyond it, barefoot, light, deliberate. The trip flares hadn't gone off. That meant someone knew where they were. Someone always did. He lit a cigarette and watched smoke twist toward the peaks. You could bomb this place for 100 years, he thought, and it would still fight back. Inside the command shack, the radio operator drew circles on a laminated map with red grease pencil, ambush zones from the last week. They gave them names like Dead Man's Turn, the L, Whisper Ridge. Everyone pretended the names helped, as if naming a place could make it less hungry. Every patrol followed routes that were already marked with their own ghosts. And still, they went out again. The valley stretched below them, green, narrow, impossibly steep. A place built for hiding and dying, not for war, but perfect for it anyway. The Americans called it the Valley of Death. The locals just called it home. By midday, the heat rose off the rocks in waves. The outpost buzzed with the small rituals of waiting, men checking ammo, tightening straps, pretending to believe that repetition meant control. The medic re-rolled his bandages for the third time, hands trembling just enough to make the tape uneven. The gunner cleaned his SAW, even though it was spotless, anything to stay busy. They'd been here long enough to know how the rhythm worked. Attack, rebuild, wait, repeat. It wasn't a war you won, it was one you outlasted. At dusk, the valley changed again. The wind died, and with it came the sound, soft, distant, human. Voices drifting through the trees, sometimes laughter, sometimes prayers in another language. Sometimes just silence that sounded too deliberate. Then came the test shots, single cracks in the distance, not aimed, not random, a way of saying, "We see you." Tracer fire answered from the outpost. Red streaks cut across the dark, fading before they reached anything real. The echoes rolled through the mountains like thunder, trying to find an end. The lieutenant listened through the radio headset. Another squad half a mile east called for illumination. The flare rose, painting the world in false daylight. Every branch, every rifle, every terrified face suddenly visible. Then, black again. Moments later, an RPG hissed from the ridge. It slammed into the wall of sandbags, showering the command post in dirt and shrapnel. No one died. That almost felt insulting. The valley wasn't trying to kill them tonight. It was reminding them that it could. Afterward, the men sat in silence, helmets off, dust clinging to sweat. The medic wrote a letter he'd never send. He stopped halfway through the line, "We're doing fine," and stared at it until the ink bled. There was no word for fine in this place. The lieutenant stood at the edge of the perimeter, staring into the black tree line. He could feel them out there, men who knew every inch of this mountain, waiting, patient, invisible. He realized then that the valley didn't care who it took. It just collected. Day by day, name by name. Later, when the generator cut out and the night returned to its natural silence, he heard the river far below. Steady, indifferent. He envied it. The river kept moving, no matter how many bodies fell into it. The medic couldn't sleep. He sat by the sandbags, listening to the valley breathe. The wind shifted, carrying faint laughter from somewhere unseen. He closed his eyes, counted his pulse, and thought, "We're not fighting an army. We're fighting a place." They woke to gunfire again. Not an attack, just harassment. A sniper on the ridge taking pot shots for sport. That was how most mornings started in the Korengal. Rounds cracked over the wire before breakfast, and by the time the echoes faded, the eggs were cold and the nerves were gone. No one flinched anymore. They just ducked, cursed, and kept eating. It was a kind of conversation, the valley's good morning. The gunner spat dust from his mouth and squinted toward the trees. He knew the sniper wouldn't miss if he wanted to. It was a message, not a kill shot. The valley liked to toy with them first. They called the main patrol route Whiskey Road. It twisted through pine and shale like a snake, each turn an ambush site already waiting to happen. They'd sweep it one day, mark the safe zones, and by morning the markers would be gone, moved, stolen, erased. The mountain reset itself faster than they could learn it. Every step out of Restrepo was a coin toss. Some patrols ended in silence, others in fire. No one ever bet on peace. By noon, the sun turned their armor into ovens. The heat shimmered off the metal plates, cooking sweat into their skin. The men walked single file, eyes scanning the ridges. Every rock looked like a muzzle flash. Every shadow looked like a man. Then came the shot, one, sharp, clean, the kind that hit before the sound did. A tree split beside the medic. He dropped instantly, heart pounding against the dirt. Another shot followed closer. No target, no direction, just death in waiting. They didn't need to say it aloud. Everyone knew what it was, a sniper, high up, far enough that they'd never find him. Someone muttered that the shooter probably lived here his whole life. He wasn't wrong. The enemy didn't visit the Korengal. They belonged to it. They crawled forward under the slope, using rocks for cover that barely covered anything. The lieutenant raised his hand to call a halt, but before he spoke, another round hit. A clean crack through a branch that showered them in splinters. He waved them back instead. Retreat wasn't surrender here. It was math. They regrouped behind a ridge that smelled of smoke and sweat. No one spoke. The silence pressed down like the air before a storm. Back at the outpost, the gunner sat with his weapon across his knees, staring at nothing. The medic wrapped the bandaged arm of a man who wasn't even bleeding badly. They both knew it didn't matter. The mountain wasn't done yet. Resupply came once a week if the weather allowed it. A Chinook would hover above the ridge long enough to kick out crates of water, ammo, and mail. The men sprinted through the rotor wash, faces stinging with dust, grabbing whatever they could before the bird pulled away. When it left, the silence returned heavier than before. That's when the medic found the letter, creased, covered in sweat and oil. The handwriting was from home, but the words didn't belong here. They never did. Night fell fast in the Korengal. The valley was a black hole after sunset. No light, no sound, just movement you could feel but never see. The men cleaned weapons by red lens flashlights. Each motion was automatic. Eject, wipe, reload, count. No one talked about the morning. No one talked about anything. One soldier kept a tally on the butt of his rifle. Not kills, just days alive. Another sharpened his entrenching tool for no reason at all. The lieutenant wrote in a small notebook, but no one knew what he wrote. Probably lies for the report. They all had their rituals. It was the only way to make time pass. At 2300, the first grenade rolled through the wire. It didn't explode, just hissed in the dirt like a warning. In the morning, they found it half buried, the pin still in place. Someone had thrown it on purpose, close enough to scare, not to kill. That was the valley's sense of humor. The lieutenant stared at it for a long time, then said what everyone was already thinking. Next time, they won't miss. He walked the perimeter as the sun rose again. Same ridges, same silence, same waiting. In the Korengal, there were only two states of being, waiting to be attacked or being attacked. There was nothing else. Over time, that truth started to change them. Voices got quieter, laughter got rarer. Home became a story they stopped telling. They learned to measure time not in days, but in firefights. A day without contact wasn't a blessing. It was an ambush delayed. The medic once said the valley was teaching them something. When asked what, he just shrugged. Maybe patience, maybe madness, maybe both. The mountain didn't care. It didn't hate or choose. It simply waited for movement and reacted. And the men waiting inside their plywood fortress began to realize they weren't fighting an enemy anymore. They were fighting the valley itself. They moved under a hard, clean moon that made the world look younger than it was. Breath hung pale. The air had that brittle clarity that carries sound too far. 6 men, 1 interpreter, no vehicles, small because small made less noise. Their mission was simple on paper. Reach 2 caves east of Restrepo, look for signs, and leave before the mountain decided otherwise. They followed a goat track etched into the ridge, left shoulders brushing pine, right boots flirting with a drop that didn't forgive. Every sound felt like confession. Night vision washed the world in ghostly green. The map promised a wider trail ahead. The mountain disagreed. 200 meters out, the interpreter froze. "Gun oil," he whispered. "Fact, not warning." Then the mountain opened its teeth. Muzzle flashes blinked in the trees. Fire came from above and below, a KS hammering the night. They dropped into the dirt, sliding through needles and stone. Tracers stitched the dark like insects. Nobody shouted orders. Survival had its own language. The lieutenant's hand signaled retreat. An RPG hit behind them, heat and shock a racing sound. For a moment the world existed only in vibration. When hearing returned, the forest coughed smoke. One gunner was down, half-conscious, blood pulsing slow but stubborn. They dragged him into a ditch that might have been a trail once. Ammo counts came in fragments. The radio hissed static, the valley's laughter. The medic pressed dressings and timed breaths. A pulse is not a promise, just a pattern that might continue. Silence followed, the kind that meant movement. They crawled out by twos, using rock and shadow. A voice somewhere above called a number in a language that needed no translation. Another RPG hissed wide. The mountain was correcting. Distance turned to survival. When the lieutenant tried the radio again, only weather answered. He spoke anyway, a ritual more than request. The interpreter muttered that someone was already ahead of them. The truth landed heavy. The mountain didn't just defend, it surrounded. They reached a horseshoe of rock that offered partial shelter and one way out. From there, they saw the caves, black mouths still smoking. Moving closer would mean giving up cover. Staying meant the mouth stayed open tomorrow. They chose to live. They cut along the slope instead, keeping low. Single shots followed, measured, patient. Men who hunted here since childhood. The patrol answered with bursts to buy seconds. The point wasn't to win, just to keep existing. The final ridge felt endless. The outpost below glowed faintly. Home, or at least the idea of it. They moved slower now, carrying the wounded, eyes hollow. When they reached the wire, others were already waiting, rifles aimed past them into the dark. The handoff was wordless. Command wanted numbers, enemy strength, ammunition spent. The lieutenant stared at the ridgeline. "Stronger than yesterday," he said. It was the only truth that fit. That night the valley played quiet. A few pot shots out of courtesy. The men cleaned weapons by red light. The medic stood at the wire, replaying the ambush frame by frame, wondering how long luck pretends to be skill. He thought about that faint scent of gun oil in the forest, how it didn't belong there, how it had saved them once. Maybe the mountain had offered the clue. Maybe next time it wouldn't. He checked his gear, told his hands to stop shaking, and looked toward the invisible caves. Below, the river murmured, patient and unchanged. Smoke drifted from somewhere unseen. The valley said nothing, but he understood anyway. The mountain had learned their names, and tomorrow it would speak them again. The next morning began without ceremony. No bugle, no sunrise worth watching. Just the soft rattle of distant gunfire echoing through the valley, too far to matter, close enough to remind them they were surrounded by a war that didn't clock out. Coffee came black and bitter, poured into tin mugs that smelled faintly of diesel. The outpost stirred like an old machine coming back to life. Boots scuffed gravel, the generator coughed, and men moved with the slow rhythm of those who'd learned that rushing never changed the outcome. They called it a quiet day, which in the Korengal meant nobody had died yet. The lieutenant stood over the map table, tracing red lines with the tip of his pen. Patrol routes, possible enemy firing points, cave entrances that may or may not exist. Every mark looked like a wound reopening. The mountain gave no feedback, no pattern, no mercy. He wanted to send a squad to recover the gear left behind in the ambush. But the radio report said there were movement trails near the ridge. That meant watchers. So the gear stayed where it was. And so did the silence. The medic sat on a crate by the sandbags, cleaning his rifle, though he'd barely fired it. He wasn't religious, but he had begun talking to his weapon the way some people talk to ghosts. Maybe because both answered the same way, quietly when you least expected it. The gunner they'd pulled out of the ditch was alive, though the corpsman said alive in that temporary way that only medics understand. Shrapnel had taken a lung, and infection was circling like a vulture. The medic checked on him twice an hour, mostly to make sure the breathing was still happening. The rest of the platoon filled the hours with maintenance, repetition, and pretending the world outside the wire didn't exist. Letters home piled up in a crate, waiting for the next helo. Some would arrive months late, some would never arrive at all. The mountain took its share of mail, too. By noon, heat shimmered across the ridgeline. The valley went still, too still. No birds, no echo. The radio hissed without reason, the kind of static that wasn't mechanical but alive. Then, faintly, came a pop, not a shot, more distant, more deliberate, a test fire. The lieutenant's head lifted, every man froze, no one said a word. Then it came, not a burst, not chaos, just a slow rhythm of gunfire rolling down the slope, each shot perfectly timed. It wasn't random, it was communication, a message in sound. 6 rounds, pause, 6 rounds, pause. A soldier whispered, "They're counting." The pattern ended as cleanly as it began. No follow-up, no movement, just the valley breathing again like nothing had happened. That was how the Korengal punished you, not through violence, but through waiting for it. The silence became heavier than the firefights. You could hear your own pulse, your own thoughts turning on you. The medic sat outside his hooch that night, boots off, socks crusted with dust. He wrote in a notebook he'd found in an abandoned Afghan schoolhouse. The pages were half math problems, half diary entries. He added his own beneath them. "The mountain doesn't shoot to kill anymore," he wrote. "It shoots to remind." Inside the command tent, the lieutenant argued over the radio with battalion. They wanted more aggression, more patrols, more proof of progress. He wanted fewer names to write in reports. Neither side was wrong. Both were losing differently. When the transmission ended, he stepped outside. The medic was still there, notebook open. The lieutenant didn't speak at first, just stared into the dark where the caves hid. Finally, he said, "You ever think the mountain just wants us gone?" The medic didn't look up. "I think it already decided we're staying." They shared the kind of silence soldiers mistake for peace, the temporary kind that comes between consequences. Hours later, the gunner stopped breathing. Quietly. No drama, no last words, just one less heartbeat in a place that already took too many. The medic marked the time and zipped the bag himself, because it felt wrong letting anyone else do it. He carried the tag to the lieutenant's desk. Another line on a list, another name that would be said once over the radio and then folded into history. Outside, the generator sputtered out. The outpost went black. The valley lit itself in moonlight, pale, cold, beautiful in a cruel way. The medic stood at the wire again, same spot as before, same smell of dust and metal, same whispering wind. He realized it wasn't the fighting that broke people here. It was the silence after. Because in the Korengal, silence was never peace. It was just the sound the dead left behind. It began with a single shot. Not an attack, just a test. A sound that made the body move before the brain understood. One round, echoing off rock, rolling through the valley like thunder in a canyon. Then, silence again. The lieutenant stepped from his hooch, vest half-fastened, boots unlaced. The night air cut clean and cold. The ridgeline glowed faintly under starlight, black teeth against a silver sky. Nothing moved, nothing visible ever did. He waited for the second shot. It came 20 seconds later. Then a third. Then the mortar. The explosion erased the stars. A wall of sound swallowed the outpost. Dirt, splinters, static. Men scrambled from bunks, half-dressed, half awake. Gunfire answered in every direction. It wasn't coordination. It was instinct. Everyone firing at shadows because shadows were all they had left. The medic hit the ground running, pack over one shoulder, ears ringing. He moved through the chaos by feel, sandbags, wire, shouts. The air reeked of cordite and fear. Somewhere, a man screamed for help, the kind that wasn't a request but a declaration. I am still alive. He found him near the south wall, shrapnel through the calf, blood pooling dark in the dust. The medic pressed gauze, muttered words he didn't believe anymore. You're fine. Just breathe. He always said that. It was never true. The lieutenant called for illumination. The flare went up, painting the valley white for 5 perfect seconds. Every ridge, every muzzle flash, every trembling hand exposed. Then darkness crashed back, heavier than before. Another mortar hit, closer. The medic hit the dirt again, face pressed into gravel that smelled like burnt oil. The world went muffled, slow, like being underwater with fire above you. When sound returned, it came back wrong, too sharp, too close. The outpost had become a drum, and the mountain was still beating. By 100, the radio was useless static. Command might as well have been on another planet. The men moved like parts of the same broken machine, firing, reloading, moving again. One gunner laughed between bursts, the dry, hysterical kind that doesn't belong to sanity anymore. The lieutenant crawled through the trench, shouting to conserve ammo. The words dissolved in the noise. The air was a solid thing, hot, wet, alive. When the first Apache arrived, its rotor wash felt like salvation. Missiles streaked into the ridges, the sound too huge to belong to Earth. The valley answered with its own thunder. The gunfire stopped for a heartbeat, then started again. They fought until 0300. After that, there was nothing left to fire and nothing left to say. When dawn came, the outpost looked like a crime scene. Walls shredded, bunkers half gone, the generator silent. The smoke turned the sunrise gray. 2 men dead, 5 wounded, everyone else pretending to function. The lieutenant walked the perimeter with a cup of coffee that tasted like dirt and metal. He didn't remember making it. The medic followed, eyes sunken, movements robotic. Neither spoke. In the stillness that followed, time stretched thin. That's when the flashback hit. Small, harmless, devastating. The medic remembered a kitchen. The sound of running water, the smell of toast, the slow hum of a refrigerator. He remembered his sister laughing about nothing, her voice bouncing off walls that didn't echo like mountains. He remembered the color yellow. He hadn't seen yellow in months. A sound snapped him back. A can rolling in the dirt. He raised his rifle before realizing it was empty. His hands shook. The tremor didn't stop when he set it down. Inside the command tent, the lieutenant stared at the report form. Engagement summary. Casualties sustained. Enemy strength unknown. He wrote the words slowly, mechanically, the way you fill out a death certificate for something that keeps breathing. Outside, the medic washed his hands for the 4th time. The water was red again. It always was. He looked at his reflection in the metal basin, a face that didn't fit the name on his uniform anymore. He thought of the kitchen again, the toast, the light. He closed his eyes and almost heard it, but the mountain never let you linger. A distant burst cracked through the morning calm, not close, not far, just enough to remind them that peace here was a rumor. The medic exhaled, wiped his hands dry on his vest, and looked to the ridge. The valley looked peaceful again. It always did. The sun rose gray that morning. Light crept over the ridges, soft and indifferent, touching everything the fire hadn't already taken. The outpost looked skeletal, wire sagging, walls half melted, the sandbags leaking dust. Men moved through it like survivors of a wreck, unsure which pieces of themselves to pick up first. They called it a victory, because they were still breathing. But in the Korengal, breathing was just the slowest way to die. The medic cleaned the aid station with shaking hands. Blood on the table, soot on the walls, everything smelled of copper and melted plastic. He found a watch in the dirt, still ticking, though no one knew whose it was. He set it on the shelf anyway. The outpost had become a museum of things that kept working long after their owners stopped. Outside, the lieutenant walked the perimeter. The mountain was quiet again. It always was after it got what it wanted. He passed the graves near the southern wall, shallow, marked with dog tags nailed to wood. The ground was too rocky to dig deep, so the bodies rested just below the surface. Each step felt like trespassing. At noon, a Chinook came for the wounded. The pilot hovered just long enough to throw dust across the valley and pull the stretchers aboard. The rotor wash turned the flag into shreds. When the sound faded, the silence rushed back in, heavy and final. The medic watched the helicopter disappear and wondered what it felt like to leave a place before it finished taking from you. That night, the outpost settled into stillness that didn't feel right. No gunfire, no movement, just wind moving through wire. The generator's hum sounded almost peaceful, a lie the men were willing to believe for a few hours. The lieutenant wrote another report. Casualties, 2 confirmed, 5 evacuated. He stared at the page, waiting for the words to mean something. They didn't. Around midnight, he walked out to the berm and lit a cigarette. The medic joined him, sitting low against the sandbags. Neither spoke. Words were a waste of oxygen. After a while, the medic said quietly, "I can't remember what quiet sounded like before this." The lieutenant nodded. "Quiet used to mean safety," he said. "Now it just means reload." They sat like that for a long time, 2 silhouettes against a horizon that never forgave. When the radio crackled, both men froze, static, then a faint voice, too faint to understand. The lieutenant leaned in, adjusting the dial. The voice came again, weak, distant, maybe echo, maybe real. Then nothing. They waited 5 full minutes before breathing normally again. The medic went back to the aid station. He sat at his cot and wrote a single line in his notebook. "If ghosts exist, they speak in static." He fell asleep with his boots still on. The dream came the same way it always did. Bright, ordinary, wrong. He was home. A kitchen again, sunlight through curtains, the sound of a faucet running. His sister laughed about something he couldn't hear. Then the laughter turned to static, and the sunlight flickered. When he looked up, the window showed a valley of smoke. He woke choking on dust that wasn't there. Outside, the lieutenant was pacing. The stars were gone behind cloud cover, and the air had that charged metallic taste that came before incoming fire. He could feel it before he heard it. The first mortar landed wide, the second landed closer, the third hit the ammo pit. The outpost erupted, shouts, alarms, the old rhythm of chaos returning like an old friend. Men sprinted for cover, half-dressed, eyes wide. The medic grabbed his pack, already knowing what he'd find. Shrapnel wounds, burns, fear. Tracer rounds cut through the dark like falling comets. The sky turned orange, then white, then black again. The lieutenant barked coordinates into the radio. No response. He tried again. Nothing. The medic dragged a man from the open, his arm shredded from shoulder to wrist. He worked by memory. Compress, wrap, tie. The man's mouth moved, but no words came out. By 0200, the fight had gone full circle. The mountain was alive again, roaring, patient, merciless. The valley never attacked out of anger. It attacked out of habit. At 0300, silence fell again. No cheers, no sighs, just smoke rising into the void. The lieutenant sat in the dirt, his rifle across his knees. The medic joined him, hands still red. They didn't look at each other. Finally, the lieutenant whispered, "Still here." The medic nodded. For now. They watched the sky turn gray again. The sun crept up behind the ridge, lighting the scars on the walls, the blood in the dust, the flag torn in half. Everything looked calm, everything looked finished. But the medic knew better. The longest night in the Korengal was always followed by another. The last patrol left at dawn. 5 men, 1 interpreter, routine sweep, valley floor, then up the northern ridge to a cluster of caves marked weeks ago on satellite maps. The sun hadn't cleared the ridgeline yet, and the air was thin and sharp. It smelled like dust, pine, and memory. They never made the check-in. At 9 o'clock, command radioed. No response. At 9:10, again, still nothing. The lieutenant stared at the handset like it might answer on its own. The radio hissed softly, the sound of distance pretending to be silence. Someone suggested the terrain was blocking the signal. But in the Korengal, they'd learned terrain didn't just block radios. Sometimes it swallowed them whole. By 10 o'clock, the QRF team geared up. Quick reaction force. 8 men, light packs, 1 medic. They moved fast, the way men move when they already suspect what they'll find. The valley was too quiet, a vacuum of sound where even birds refused to exist. Half a mile in, they found the first sign, a drop of blood on a leaf, then another, then drag marks fading into the slope. They followed the trail up the ridge. Each step felt heavier, like the mountain itself was warning them to turn back. The medic caught a smell first, faint, metallic, final. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The bodies appeared behind a fallen log, slumped in unnatural stillness. No helmets, no rifles, just 2 figures facing the valley like they had been watching it when the world stopped. Dog tags still on, eyes gone to glass. The medic knelt beside them and pressed a pulse he knew wasn't there. He whispered the names anyway. Saying them made it real. The lieutenant called it in. Static answered. Command told them to pull back, but the lieutenant kept looking up, toward the ridge that still watched them back. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the valley was teaching him how. They climbed anyway. The path narrowed until it was little more than a scar cut into stone. Every step crunched louder than it should have. Every breath felt stolen. Then, the interpreter stopped. He said he heard something. Voices, faint, familiar. They froze. The medic listened. At first it sounded like wind. Then it wasn't. Voices carried through the trees, repeating call signs, their call signs, soft, clear, almost friendly. Phoenix 2, Phoenix 3. The lieutenant turned down his radio. The voices didn't stop. No one spoke after that. They just kept climbing. When they reached the caves, the smell hit them first. Burned cloth, wet metal, something ancient. Inside, the walls were scorched. Spent casings littered the ground, but no bodies, no gear. Just empty packs, a few footprints in the dust, and something carved into the stone. The medic ran his light across it. Letters in English, jagged and uneven. "We are still here." The lieutenant stepped closer. His throat was dry, his mind searching for logic that didn't exist here. He told himself maybe it was graffiti from another unit, but something in his gut said otherwise. The interpreter refused to go farther. He said the cave wasn't empty, not haunted, just waiting. They backed out slowly, the air behind them colder than the air they'd walked through. Then the radio crackled. Not command, not static, just one word, low, drawn out, barely human. Run. They did. downhill through loose rock and whispering trees, slipping, falling, swearing. Every echo followed them like footsteps. Gunfire snapped behind them, random, distant, maybe real, maybe not. No muzzle flashes, no shouts, just the sound of pursuit made of air and fear. When they reached the wire an hour later, the valley was dead silent again. They collapsed inside, gasping. Command demanded answers. The lieutenant gave none. He just handed over the radio, still hissing with a static that almost sounded like breathing. That night, the wind came down from the ridges, carrying faint fragments of sound, not words, not language. The men stopped pretending they didn't hear it. Some said it was enemy taunting through stolen comms. Some said it was the mountain talking back. The medic wrote nothing in his notebook that night. He just sat on the edge of his cot, listening. When he closed his eyes, he could still hear his own call sign whispering from somewhere up the ridge. By morning, command logged the mission as inconclusive. The missing patrol was marked no recovery possible. The valley stayed quiet. But in the static, if you listened hard enough, you could still hear them. The orders came at dawn. No ceremony, no speech, just a radio burst cutting through static like mercy. All Restrepo personnel prepare for extraction. 48 hours. For a long moment, no one moved. The medic stared at the words scrawled on the whiteboard, unsure if they meant escape or abandonment. Then someone laughed, short, cracked, disbelieving. The sound didn't last long. By mid-morning, the men were tearing down their own defenses. Sandbags split open, spilling dust that had outlived too many of them. Ammo crates were stacked for burning. Anything too heavy to carry was buried. The outpost looked like a carcass being picked clean. The lieutenant walked the perimeter one last time. The ridges were still there, still watching. He wondered if the mountain knew they were leaving. It felt like it did. At noon, the sun hit the wire just right, and for a heartbeat, the valley looked harmless. That illusion didn't survive the first mortar. It came from the east ridge, one clean arc that landed in the empty supply pit. No casualties, just a reminder. The valley wasn't finished. By nightfall, the shelling grew steady, one round every few minutes, measured like a metronome. The men worked under the blasts, packing radios and rations, pretending the noise didn't mean anything. Every impact threw the same question into the air. Would the mountain let them go? The medic moved between bunkers, checking the wounded who wouldn't be lifted until morning. He felt the tremor in the earth each time another round hit, a heartbeat under his boots. When the generator died, the world went black, except for muzzle flashes in memory. At 100, the mortars stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed against their ears until they could hear their own blood. Then came the laughter, distant, echoing from the ridge, not loud, not close, just enough to prove someone was still up there. The lieutenant ordered everyone to rest, but no one slept. They sat in trenches with their rifles across their knees, eyes fixed on the horizon that never changed. The medic counted breaths instead of minutes. At 0540, the first Chinook appeared, a shadow gliding between peaks, rotors carving the dawn. The sound of it filled the valley like a memory of civilization. Men rose from foxholes, waving infrared strobes, faces expressionless. The mountain woke with it. RPG trails cut through the morning haze, 3, maybe 4. One exploded short. The second hit near the LZ, sending up a geyser of dirt. The third missed the helicopter by 10 feet, close enough to rattle the frame. The pilot's voice came through, flat and calm. 30 seconds on the ground, 30 seconds to erase a year, 30 seconds to carry out what the valley hadn't claimed. The medic moved first, loading the wounded, limp bodies strapped tight, faces turned from the light. The rest followed, running bent, gear clattering, bullets snapping through the dust. He almost turned back when he saw the small cross near the wall. Murphy's grave, marked by bent rebar and a tag still shining. Almost. The lieutenant grabbed his arm and pulled him inside. The ramp closed. The Chinook lifted. Below them, the outpost collapsed in slow motion, walls folding, sandbags splitting, smoke rising like breath. The ridges closed around it until the valley looked whole again, untouched, waiting. The medic stared through the open gun bay as the ground fell away. He wanted to feel relief. All he felt was unfinished. The radio crackled one last time. Restrepo site abandoned, all units outbound. The words sounded official, sterile, false. The lieutenant sat across from him, helmet in his lap, face gray with exhaustion. He looked out the window and said nothing. No one did. When the helicopter banked east, sunlight spilled through the cabin, gold, clean, unforgiving. The medic watched the river glint far below, winding through the same valley that had tried to bury them. It looked peaceful again. It always did. The men didn't cheer. They didn't talk. They just stared down at the place that had taken everything and given them nothing but the right to leave. In the headset, a voice asked for confirmation. Mission complete? The lieutenant keyed the mic, eyes still on the valley. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just whispered the truth the mountain already knew. We're gone. The plane touched down long after dark. No flags, no handshakes, no speeches, just the hum of engines cooling and the hollow sound of boots on concrete. They stepped out into fluorescent light that looked too clean to be real. The air smelled like oil, not dust. Someone said, "Welcome home." No one answered. They moved through the motions. Medical checks, paperwork, signatures that turned months of fire into a few lines of ink. The forms said, redeployed. The faces said somewhere else. The medic turned in his rifle, his body armor, his ID card. Each piece felt like skin being peeled off. In the barracks, the beds were too soft. The silence was worse. It wasn't the kind that meant danger. It was the kind that made you remember what danger sounded like. Every creak, every cough, every closing door felt like an echo from a place that hadn't stopped calling. He tried to sleep but woke at 3:47, heart racing, certain he'd heard mortars, just a garbage truck 2 streets away. Still, he crawled to the window before he remembered there were no ridges here, only rooftops, only quiet. At the VA, a nurse asked him to rate his pain on a scale from 1 to 10. He said, "Define pain." She circled 8. He didn't correct her. Group therapy came next. A dozen chairs, one clock that ticked too loud. Nobody talked for the first 50 minutes. When they did, it wasn't about the war. It was about the silence that followed it. A man cried without sound. The medic didn't look up. He understood. Back home, family spoke in gentle tones like he might break. They asked if he was okay. He smiled the way soldiers do when the answer doesn't fit in a sentence. He said he was fine. He wasn't lying. He just wasn't finished. The lieutenant called once a month. They never talked about Afghanistan, just work, weather, traffic. Every conversation ended with the same pause, the kind that meant both men were still in the same place, just surrounded by different scenery. One night, the medic opened a drawer and found the letter, Murphy's handwriting. Creased, dirt-stained, alive in a way Murphy wasn't. He unfolded it slowly, afraid the paper might bleed. "It's quiet tonight," it read. "We can hear the river. It doesn't care what we do up here. Tell my brother I finally get it. We're just practicing being uncomfortable." He folded it back up and sat there until the clock changed hours. Then he put it in his wallet. Some things you carry even when they stop weighing anything. Spring turned to something that didn't have a name. He stopped counting days. Time didn't feel linear anymore, just a series of distances between sounds. The slam of a car door, the whistle of a kettle. Every noise was a test. He passed most of them. The first time he went back to work, someone dropped a stack of metal trays in the kitchen. He hit the floor before they did. Nobody said anything. They just helped him up and pretended it didn't happen. At night, he ran. City blocks instead of ridges, traffic lights instead of flares. He ran until the sound of his breath replaced the sound of gunfire. It was the closest thing to peace he'd found. Years later, they told him the Korengal was abandoned, the outpost gone, the valley reclaimed by trees and ghosts. He didn't feel relief, just recognition. The mountain had outlasted them all. Sometimes, when the world got too quiet, he still heard the radio hiss. Not words, just that faint, familiar static. It reminded him that some places never really let you leave. He'd wake, step outside, and listen to the wind move through the trees. It never said his name, but it never stopped trying. He'd close his eyes and whisper, "You can keep it." The wind would pause as if it understood. He'd breathe once, steady, like on patrol. And for a few seconds, the silence almost felt like mercy.